So, hello, dear listeners. This is Astrid from Spiritual Alchemy Show, yet another week. And as always, I'm always paranoid about you not being able to hear me. So, please, as always, if you're on ParaX Radio Network, please let me know in the chat room that you can hear me. And I'm not here alone. Or actually, I am here alone, but not completely because across the Atlantic, I have Al Cummins with me today. Hi, Al.
Hello, Astrid. How are you?
Now you're all confused because I said he's across the Atlantic and you hear British accent, right? Now all you are confused. Okay.
Hope you can hear me now as well.
So I was just trying to introduce you. Al is obviously an occultist. That's basically almost everybody that's on this show. And he's doing all sorts of other things like astrology and geomancy. And that's the thing we're going to talk about today. So thank you so much, Al, to come today to talk about geomancy. I'm going to say straight away that Al is going to have a course about geomancy starting in February. So he's going to just talk about today about what actually geomancy is, because I think people are really interested in anything that's either predictive or advisory, just any of that. Like people love tarot, people love eye checking. So it's very interesting that actually some sort of a divinationary methods actually kind of becomes slightly less known. So I'm really glad you're going to talk about it today. So hi Al, thank you so much for coming out. Hoping you are here and you can hear me fine.
I can indeed, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Astrid.
Great. So if you can, I guess not many people actually know what geomancy, is. So if you can, describe how does it even look like, if it's on the paper, if it's dice, how does it look like, and how does it work?
Sure, yeah. Well, the easiest way to talk about geomancy is to partition off a couple of things that get called geomancy straight off the bat. It is a particular system. It's not simply all divination that has anything to do with the earth, although that's one use of that term. The other terms that aren't the kind of geomancy that I do include things to do with ley lines and also things to do with kind of Western equivalents of things like feng shui, about arranging things in particular places and facing particular directions. Mm-hmm. Now, there is directional magic and spellcraft and meaning to pointing in particular directions in a variety of European, they're called the Western magical traditions. But geomancy itself, as I practice it, is primarily a form of divination, not exclusively, but it's a form of divination made up of 16 answers or figures, is probably the easiest way of putting it. And one of the easy ways to put people in the picture about it is to get them to recall a hexagram from the I Ching and the Book of Changes, which, being a hexagram, has 6 broken or unbroken lines. Geomancy is similar in that its 16 answers are also made up of roads with 1 or 2 dots or broken or unbroken lines, if you like, but only 4 as opposed to 6. So there are only 16 figures, and amongst those you have a variety of different answers. And the way typically a geomantic divination session will work, that you will cast a number of figures in a particular chart known as a shield, which is so because it's usually shield shaped like that. And so one of the main things about geomancy is that it is based on the language, or we could say the symbols, if we like, the meanings taken from astrology, without tracking any of the movements of the stars across the heavens. And that's where often astrologers and geomancers kind of politely disagree with each other, in that geomancy looks at the power and the virtue of the planets and the signs and the houses of the heavens. The shield chart is normally arranged primarily around the 12 houses, which reflect 12 facets of someone's life or situation, which gives you specific places to look for whichever figure is speaking in that house, that place. But it doesn't track the actual movements of the stars. That's the key difference, really. Sometimes I think about it in terms of if the planets, the word planetes comes from that Greek, it means the wandering ones or wandering stars as they move across the sky. If the planets are wandering, then geomancy is kind of like using the foot track or the footprints of those planets on the Earth, and it's about what astrology looks like on the ground, and often comes up with very grounded, realistic kind of plans and meaning. So does that make sense as a kind of introduction?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. So you said it's like a quite like few different ways how to actually cast the geomantic figures. So you mentioned there's few ways how to cast them, and when I look in your articles, you're mentioning basically making lines and then count how many lines you made or points you made, and if it's odd, make 2 dots. If it's even, they make 1 dot. But is there any other way how to do it? It's like if maybe I've seen some sort of like a dice, or what is there all the other ways how you can actually cast the figures?
Sure. Well, what we can talk about then are a couple of traditional methods, very old traditional, slightly more recent traditional, and some very new techniques. And so the old school ways of doing it. So let's back up a little bit. It's thought that what we might call Western or European geomancy almost certainly emerges from Arabic Islamic practice, a form of divination that's usually called striking the sand or sand cutting or even sand writing, or the science of sand, a variety of things around that. And what they would do, these Arabic geomancers, these diviners, they would flatten an area of sand, either in a box or on the ground, and they would mark. They would make a number of marks, having made ardent prayer and put themselves in a trance-like kind of state, and they would make marks without counting them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way you would and what this would do is you would then have a random number of marks that you would tally up to make odd or even points, and you would do 4 sets of uncounted marks, and you would then tally those up, and that would give you your figure. So if you came up with 4 lines and there were 3 let's say 3 odd numbers of lines and then 1 even number of dots on the line, that would be we call that, you can kind of do these hand signals with them if you can see. You would have say 1 dot, 1 dot, 1 dot, 2 dots, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think about that, it's a figure. That would be what we call it in Western geomancy, at least, cauda draconis, so the tail of the dragon, which signifies an ending of some kind, to pull one out of the air. Which is to say that, so this very old traditional method is to mark the ground, right? Hence one of the ways in which it's called geomancy. It's only one of the reasons that's given us why it's called that. One of them is that you're divining using the ground, using earth or dust, sand or dirt sometimes. That carried over into the medieval and the early modern periods in Europe and elsewhere by making marks on a piece of paper, doing exactly the same thing, inflaming oneself with prayer, we might say, entering some kind of state where you would receive direction either from God or particular spirits or the spirit of the world, the spiritus mundi or the anima mundi, and you would make a supposedly random number of dots, and then you would tally up the number and see whether it was odd or even, and you do that 4 times for each figure. You do that a certain number of times to generate the figures of the chart, the 4 first figures, which get called the mother figures because they birth the rest of the chart. Which, without going into the details, because we don't need to at that point, that's one of the main ways that geomancy, that the figures were generated. But the kind of open secret is that really geomancy can be, figures can be generated by any number of ways that you can generate odd or even numbers or binary systems of any sort. I often get clients to flip a coin for the figure which comes from them, and whether or not that's.
So actually really interesting that you mentioned a prayer. Is there any specific prayer that it should be, or is it like specific religion prayers, one like specific saint prayer, or is it just have to be some sort of a prayer?
Well, that's an interesting question because a lot of the early modern geomancers that I studied, a lot of the 17th century geomancers and occult philosophers and magicians, emphasize prayer without necessarily emphasizing particular prayers. So it isn't like there are necessarily a set of geomancers' prayers. This was very much more about attuning oneself to the divine through open heart and speaking extemporaneously. I think probably. That said, there are an awful lot of utilities or working with planetary spirits in geomancy, at least through the geomancy of one particular practitioner in the 17th century, John Hayden, whose work I use heavily, and that involves often praying to the planetary spirit of that day. So he kind of implies that if you're doing divination about love, you should wait until Friday, being the day ruled by Venus, and you should be including the seal of Kedemel, the spirit of Venus, and maybe some Venusian prayers. And I find that useful. Personally, in my own practice, I use the prayer of the gnomes because while I don't think geomancy works exclusively with and only with earth elementals, or gnomes as they get called very often, that prayer seems to respond well. It seems to work well, and the spirits that cohere around geomancy of these figures, of the planets that rule those figures, and of the spirits and shades of these magicians that cohere around the system, they all seem to respond well to that particular prayer.
I also noticed that in one of your blog posts, you actually mentioned something really interesting, and that is, I would say, the importance not just the actual casting, but also the place where you cast. That's something that, let's say, I would say with other methods like tarot, or you may be being told that you should have some sort of like a silk scarf and you kind of put it, but it seems like nobody actually really pays attention to the actual space where you are casting. But you actually wrote a beautiful blog post, which I recommend to everybody to read, about it. So you think it's like for geomancy it's actually important, or what's the role actually of the actual physical place where you are doing the geomancy, not just, let's say, the beats or the dots themselves?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think consecrating the space that you're working in is very important. When I work in my little home office divining for clients, usually through webcams and things like that, but I do in-person stuff as well. I have a whole setup as most professional readers tend to, but I also have a field kit, and part of my field kit are beaded talismans that look like necklaces, but I use to demark space. And that's I think the article that I wrote about circling ways, that the Roots talks about those. And the idea of it being a quick method of delineating a space. And I wouldn't say that these are necessary for geomancy at all, but they help, right? You can divine without any prayers, without any setup, but those things help both in terms of clarity and in terms of insight and in terms of, especially if you are also utilizing relationships with helping spirits or familiar spirits or spirits of the system itself who are helping you to divine, right? And when that's the case, making sure that they have a suitably envirtued space and time is very helpful for getting the best answer for your clients.
Also, you mentioned that obviously geomancy ties down to astrology, and you can actually use astrological houses together with geomancy, which sounds like, oh wow, how? So, can you tell our listeners how actually it works, how, because you have collection of dots right now once you casted it, and how you combine it with the houses from astrology, and how are the houses similar or kind of different or exactly the same, just a little bit different?
Sure. So the main thing, we talked about how a traditional geomantic chart is known as a shield because it's shield shaped, and it's made of 15 places, we could say. If we take the analogy of like a spread in tarot, right? It's made of 15 different places. The first 12 of those are just the houses of the heavens, as done by medieval, certainly by early modern standard. The first figure concerns the queer and their personality and life and body. The second concerns their riches. The third concerns communication. The fourth, their home or land. The fifth, their recreation as well as their skills. The sixth, their work or their servants, and so on and so on. So they are the same. The final three figures the final three places in a shield chart are known as the witnesses and the judge, or collectively the court of the shield, right? And these offer not just a final answer in the form of the judge, which gives you, definitively all of this. So after you've ranged across the whole, board, the whole 12 facets of someone's life situation, you come to a judgment, right? A decision on the question, which is the judge figure. That's informed by two witnesses. So you can do all sorts of the things that you can do with the 3-card spread interpretation, right? You could talk about the witness being the start of the situation, the second witness being how that will change, and the judge being the final result of that change, right? So there's a process going on, as well as just one of 16 figures being given as an answer. And in fact, owing to the way that the figures are generated, you can actually only have 8 of those 16 figures as a judge. So there are somewhere around 130 configurations, court configurations. So from these 16 figures, we can generate an awful lot of different answers. And even then, they are keyed to specific context, depending on the nature of the question that was asked. So if a client asks about their love life, for instance, that's assuming we're talking about their, long-term monogamous partner, that would be classically a 7th house issue, right? So you would look at the first house, the querent, which tells you about the client, and then you look to the 7th house, which tells you about their relationship. And you would use that for an interpretation. You could also use the court, right? So the court gives you a sense of the process of what's going on and a kind of judgment on it. And the specific houses that you would use in the first 12 places of the chart, which is, let's be honest, most of the chart, gives you a sense of the particular characterization of a particular circumstance. You can offer both very broad, wide-angle pictures, and you can also zoom in on particular details. And you can also see how those details relate to other houses. So if you have the same, one of the features that makes geomancy particularly interesting to me is that you can have the same figure crop up in more than one house. And when that happens, we talk about it springing to another house. And so this means that the client is asking about, how to further their career, and you see that, for instance, Puella, the figure of the girl or the maiden, is in the 10th house of career. And you also see that Puella turns up in, say, the 3rd house, the figure of communication and siblings, for instance. Then you might well be able to recommend to the client, depending on whatever else was going on in the chart, that in order to further your career, you could do with reaching out to your brother, who might have, this hot tip about a cool job that would further your career, right? So you can link the different facets of someone's life and their situation to uncover various connections and ways in which can be their goals that they're at be further.
That's something, if I understand it correctly, was like one of the things that when I was reading through it, found the most interesting. Like, it feels to me like the charts, like if you divide the geomancy into houses, like it's easier to see the links between different areas of your life than you can see in astrology. I think in astrology, like you have like oppositions and trines and stuff like that, but it feels to me like this is like give me some extra layer of information. It's not just like, yeah, this works, now this is opposition, no, it doesn't work. So felt to me like, you can like find like the subtle meanings.
To my astrologer friends, to be fair, and the many professional friends, there are ways in astrology to look at how one house relates to another house, like the rule significate, and various other aspects of ways in which the planets can talk to the configurations they rule. And I should also point out that in some forms of geomancy, we do include aspects of sorts. Obviously, we don't deal with the actual movements of the stars, but we borrow those interpretive techniques from astrologers using the same kind of charts and use those to see how different houses and the figures within them relate to each other.
So if somebody, let's say, is listening and is really interested into geomancy, but like loads of people has no knowledge or very little knowledge of astrology, is geomancy doable without astrology? I know this is not a great questions, but all of you lazy ones that are listening, I'm asking on your behalf. I'm taking that burden on my chest. You just thinking about it, but you never asked on air, so I'm doing it for you. So
that's very noble of you, Astrid.
That's it. I know. That's self-sacrificing. Okay, so I'm going to like form it the way I would expect some people to ask. It's like, hey, is it like really needed to like learn astrology? I was just like, it's hard.
There's two ways you can answer that. One of them is sort of, right? There is a move, there are geomancers who say that, really the figures should stand on their own 2 feet, right? That even though each of the figures is considered ruled by a planet, and in some cases ruled by several planets, the 2 figures that are associated with Jupiter, for instance, are acquisitio, or gain, which is fairly self-explanatory, and Laetitia, joy, which hopefully is also fairly self-explanatory as well. Now, for me, as someone who's very engaged in planetary magic, this is fascinating because it gives an example of the 2 hands or the 2 feet of Jupiter in the world, with the hand that is jovial, that is literally like about joy, and the hand that is about like gain and benevolence and generosity and prosperity, right? And so I find geomancy to accord very neatly with planetary magic, for instance. So I would say you need the planets, but I would say that the signs are worth learning because they provide extra flavor. Now, each of the figures, the 16 figures of geomancy, is also attributed to a zodiacal sign. Now, the issue is that almost no geomancers can agree on a particular correspondence system. Everyone agrees that you can use the zodiac to understand the 16 figures, but the range of answers is huge. And my advice then is to simply look to what makes sense for you. So, for instance, the figure of Pua, the boy or the warrior, as it's occasionally called, is a figure of Mars. It's the idea of the young warrior setting out on their journey. It's a very sort of Joseph Campbell modern myth kind of character or figure. And that's often, not always, but often associated with Aries as the cardinal fire that kicks off spring, right? Pua, the boy, is very good at beginnings, that childlike enthusiasm, but also isn't necessarily terribly good at sticking endings, right? It gets bored too easily. And so that's a way of understanding the figure through its association with a zodiacal sign. But the other answer would be yes, absolutely, you need astrology, but you need the language and the poetry and the meaning of astrology and the stars, right? You don't need to know necessarily about some of the detailed setting of ephemerides and of exactly what planet will be where when, but you do need to know how to consider things like what does it mean when a fiery planet like Mars is becoming interlinked in some way with a cooling planet like the Moon, right? And so that's a way that astrology can help geomancers. So I think it's one of those cases where, sure, you can just learn the 16 figures and what they mean. They're usually fairly self-explanatory. Gain, loss, the way, the crowd, those kinds of things. Some of them get a bit weird, the dragon's head, the dragon's tail. Some of them are a little bit alchemical, like rubius, the reddening or the red, and the white, the whitening. But you could learn them just for themselves, but you would still need to learn what each figure means in each house, right? And that's the start of it. And then you would also need to know the difference between when the order in which the witnesses manifest matters. So if you have two witnesses and the judge at the end of your shield chart, if the first witness is, let's say, conjunctio, the deal that is made, or union of some kind, and the second witness is acquisitio, gain, then you could say, you're about, one could say, depending on what else was going on in the chart and the context of the question, you're about to sign a contract of some kind, and it's about to be very good for you, and you'll prosper from it, right? But if you swap those two figures round, if the first figure was acquisitio and the second figure was conjunctio, the second witness, then instead what you're seeing is a process whereby you have come into money, and now you are having to sign a contract about it, right? But that's usually a figure of, and this is why a lot of astrology is still kind of phrased in medieval speech, because that's when it was very popular. But that core configuration, for instance, is said to be usually about inheritance and the divvying up of money, right? So it matters which way round the witnesses fall, right? Which is why we have that, whatever it is, 128 different court configurations. You would still need to learn all that stuff, even if you didn't want to learn any of the astrology, right? And this can take a while, but it's a very simple set of principles, these 16 figures, and then how they interact with each other, and the iterations of how they interact produce an eventual vast complexity. With a shield chart having 15 places and there being 16 possible answers, there are something like 64,500 different specific shield charts that you could generate. No one's saying you have to learn all those, but but in knowing how different figures interact with each other, there's a wealth of information there that you can dip in as much as you want, or you can keep it as simple as you want. I sometimes liken geomancy to playing the bass guitar, which is something I did as a teenager and into my 20s, playing in punk bands and things. And I think it's like the bass guitar because there are 4 strings, like there are 4 rows in a geometric figure. And you can pick up a bass and be, okay at it pretty quickly, right? You can stand at the back and play along, just about, it's practice, but you can do that. But it takes a lifetime to master, right? And that's very much what I feel like geomancy is versus something like, electional astrology, for instance, which feels a lot more like the violin, where, I don't know if my sister played the violin for a while, kid, and if you've never been around someone learning to play the violin from scratch, it sounds horrible for the first while, until suddenly it all starts to make sense. You get that beautiful, harmonies that come through. And so I think geomancy is one of those systems that very quickly rewards people putting in even a modicum of effort, but the intricacies of it, take a long time to get down. So a lifetime to master, but an afternoon to pick up.
I definitely agree. I'd say with the astrology, it's like unless you open astrology book for the first time and you open directly at the pages where are the ephemerides, that usually have quite shocking. Definitely that for me. But I would say astrology, and I believe geomancy will be the same. It's kind of looks scary at the beginning, but then you find out as you go on. It's like, oh my god, this is really precise. Oh my god, okay, there is no way around it. It's just like have to bite through it because let's say astrology, it's I would say quite impenetrable and hard at the beginning, but like once you get to it, you just find out that the precision is just like, yeah, there is no way around it.
Yeah, it rewards that, and anything precise is going to require a certain degree of complexity and subtlety and attention to detail, right?
But also you mentioned the zodiac, so you can use the zodiac. But isn't that like, okay, if I'm trying to like avoid astrology and I'm going to use a zodiac, isn't it a bit like, okay, I'm not going to use Saturn, no Saturn, okay, Capricorn. So it's like, yeah, it's kind of the same thing. So it would be actually, even with the zodiac, wouldn't it be actually easier for the person to actually use astrology together?
I think you can get away with attention to the planets, and that's not, I would never claim to speak for all geomancers because we are a heterogeneous bunch, which you can tell from at least the medieval period onwards, is everyone agrees on the basics, and then the specifics people get very particular and idiosyncratic about. So for me, I think learning the planets, learning what Saturn is about in order to understand what the figures of Karka or imprisonment and the figure of Tristitia or sorrow are about is very important and very useful, and provides a wealth of material and practical techniques and methodologies that are really useful to a geomancer. So I think the concentration on planets is very important. I think you. I don't want to give people a license to be lazy about it, but you could get a fair way through just learning the figures for themselves and not what different zodiacal signs they're, for instance.
You just didn't tell them, don't encourage it. No. No.
Divination is difficult, right?
I'm always telling on this show that today people nowadays are getting just like every generation is stupider and lazier, and that's terrible. Like people 100 years ago, they could speak like 5 languages and could do like all sorts of math and physics and was considered to be normal. Obviously, if they had money and been noblemen. Obviously, if they were not like, where it's like has to be like you had to be certain color, gender, and position. But if you are, then feel free to like. You're supposed to be expected to know all of this stuff, and just like people today's now, I think people nowadays like need to try harder in learning stuff. So yeah, don't encourage it. No, forget what he said. You have to learn it. I'm just being terrible. So what is like the ideal situation for geomancy? What is like the ideal, because every divination method tend to be good for something else. Because, like, for example, if you have a situation and you have a tarot, the tarot is usually like, oh yeah, no, you have to transform. This is just a lesson. You have to come up with the new ideas. And then you pull Lenormand cards, and those are like, yeah, he's cheating. Now you know it. Happy? He's cheating with your sister. Happy now? So what is the ideal, like, what's the language? What's the ideal situation for the geomancy?
So I read in 3 different modalities, so I can talk about those. I read playing cards, cartomancy, from a set of folk magical practices, often drawing on the same kind of things that go into African American hoodoo and conjure. I read geomancy and I read tarot. And for me, I very much agree. Tarot can often feel like a particularly batty great aunt who comes out with all of this wisdom, as well as all of this kind of odd stuff that you're like, oh, okay, auntie, thanks for that. Whereas cartomancy on the other extreme, like you say, is very much like, oh, you're cursed. You better be taking some spiritual baths about now. You better get to a crossroads about that. And I find geomancy is very much in the middle of that. It provides very grounded explanations. You can look to see, things that get called cross conditions, bad luck, ways in which the client is getting in their own way, as well as, checking for maleficia that may have been thrown by a rival. But it's also kind of gnomic, right? Without needing to pun too hard about that. It can provide answers that are things that you reflect on for longer, right, than just a simple yes or no to a particular set of circumstances, right? So I find geomancy, especially in the way it speaks in this kind of language of the planets, is very helpful for getting at what people can do if they have a modicum of training or a magical practice themselves. I find it particularly good for that. You know, if the figure that comes up in the 12th house of restriction, right, of the things that are getting in your way to achieve your goal, you know, is a martial figure. You know, work with Mars to understand how to integrate those competitive or even aggressive aspects of yourself or the situation to a good goal, right? Likewise, you could also work with Venus as being one of the few planets that's friendly with Mars in order to rebalance that imbalance that's restricting you at present, right? So I like geomancy because the answers that it gives don't just phrase what the situation is. It also offers a variety of approaches to ameliorating that, to remedying that in some way, whether that's to try and avoid a bad thing happening or to secure our blessings, you know, the good stuff that's going on.
Also, I was really interested when we were talking about it before the show, that you mentioned that you liked some sort of advisory aspect of the geomancy. But is it like something that nowadays people do? Because let's say with tarot, this whole idea of a tarot as kind of like fortune telling or any basically divinatory method as some sort of advisory-ish, I would say it's fairly new. Because from my experience, centuries of basically tell me, am I going to win the battle or am I going to lose the battle? Type of thing. So was it with geomancy like the similar? Was it also like mostly predictive, or was it advisory even down in the past? And how does it look now?
That's a very good question. So the first thing to say is that it absolutely is predictive. It absolutely will answer, you know, how something will go down, right? And it can be very specific and pretty complicated about how it works those things out from the basic frameworks that I've kind of outlined here. So it absolutely was in its height, which was in the Renaissance period, in the 16th century. It was considered one of the most accurate forms of divination around in Europe, and it was, you know, the preserve of the courts of European royalty and people with money and power who consulted with geomancers, along with consulting with astrologers to see, as you say, you know, whether or not they would win in a battle. And likewise, astrologers and geomancers could also predict what would happen and then offer advice to try and get round a defeat or to secure a victory. So it didn't just offer whether or not, you know, your client would drop dead of the plague or not, but also how to avoid dropping dead of the plague. And that's why I say it's both predictive and advisory. When I say advisory, I don't mean it's just therapy or it's just a psychological model or anything like that. But what I do mean is that I find it much more useful to not simply predict what will happen for a client, but help them work through ways in which they can strategize to achieve the things they want to achieve and avoid the things they want to avoid. If you ask, will I get this job? That's not necessarily a terribly useful question, right? If you're going for a job interview, because either you believe the diviner and, you know, either turn up to the interview or don't bother turning up, in which case you won't get the job, or you disbelieve them and then you've wasted both of your time, right? So I find often working out what it is you want and then working out how, you know, then asking, how do I achieve this thing I want? How real? And one of the advantages, again, of using the houses of the heavens and the court of the two witnesses and the judge is that geomancy will tell you if your plan is completely unrealistic, right? It will tell you if, you know, you're fantasizing. It'll tell you if you don't have the resources you need to do that, and you need to concentrate on building that first, right? It can reveal that kind of information. And so what I'm interested in is that that prescriptive element of European divination that was often lost, because even though we know that geomancy was incredibly popular in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was very rare for geomancers to write down what they told their clients to do about something. And that's arguably because that's a little bit close to sorcery, which after various witchcraft acts became various degrees of illegal, right? It wasn't necessarily illegal to divine, because you could argue that it was simply a kind of approach to God's plan in the natural world, right? Anyone can watch the stars move, right? anyone can pray and, throw 4 coins down on the floor, make marks on the floor while reading the Bible or something. The idea of looking isn't necessarily wrong, but poking at the workings of the universe is considered a bit more closer to taking matters too far into one's own hands, right? So as a result, in studying the history of this stuff, we often don't have records for some of the magical remediation and prescriptions that were presented, the things that the client should avoid doing and the things that they should be encouraged to do in order to help bring about the course of events that they wanted to secure, right? And so I would say absolutely, to return to the question, I would say that geomancy is absolutely predictive. It can be, but that is not always the most useful use of it, right? And that, if you know what you want, then you can go to a diviner and say, look, this is what I want to try and achieve. What are the best ways I can do this? And geomancy can find various ways that you can look in unexpected places to find the resources and the inspirations and the grounding to be able to achieve those things.
I'm actually really happy that you mentioned the illegal waters of sorcery, because it kind of leads me to, I would say, one of the questions I wanted to have. And I was just like, with these questions, we are entering the advanced corner. So it's like so like all the like advanced magician corners, unless you are obviously trained occultists, don't try that at home, or if you're trying it at home, choose somebody else's home. So terrible. Obviously, when I was reading through articles, it's fairly obvious that geomancy has quite strong applications in our ritual magic. It seems to me you're mostly mentioning like the things from the Western tradition, the Western ritual magic, which I found really interesting. You're talking about how is it actually can be combined with evocations. So obviously we've been talking about the planetary correspondences. So that kind of leads us like we already know where this is going with evocations. Just, all the advanced ones, I know you know where we are going. But, okay, so if you can use it with evocation, how you can use it, let's say, with evocations, and what can you evoke with it?
Well, the most obvious way of approaching that is that one of the early modern geomancers that I draw a lot of inspiration from, the guy I mentioned earlier, John Hayden. He actually talks specifically about how each of the geomantic figures has a spirit that he locates by the names of the angels of the zodiac. So that's another way in which the zodiac can be useful. But he's talking specifically in terms of an angelology of geomancy, as well as kind of invoking the planetary rulers or the planetary spirits with a capital S that you find in, say, Agrippa and various other, bastions of the Western occult traditions. So the most obvious answer is it's a useful way of evoking planetary and zodiacal angels and spirits. But from the notion of utilizing the patterns of occult virtue that each of the 16 figures kind of coheres around it, you can also use those to a wide variety of other purposes. The spirit surrounds the figure of Albus, for instance, the Whitening, which is a figure of solitude and scholarship and of being very bloodless and of kind of removing yourself a little bit from the world. That kind of has that hermit vibe from the tarot, but it's also about study and scholarship and studiousness, and it's also kind of very Vulcan, not Hephaestus-like, but Star Trek-wise. It's very logical and doesn't really deal with emotion a lot. But the spirits around that can often be helpful for study, right? They can often be spirits associated with like scholarship, memory, libraries, archiving, those kinds of things. So like any divination system, the answers of it, the 16 figures in this case, are a way of dividing up the cosmos into 16 easy manageable chunks, or 16 primary colors, if we like, that we can then mix specific patterns and shades on our palette to paint with, right? So likewise, those 16 colors might be considered the secondary colors behind the primary 7 colors of the planets, right? So the idea of using the figures as a locus of occult virtue by which you can cohere other spirits, that you can speak in a language that they'll understand. You know, you go to war with someone, you know, if you're sending heavy war magic curses, then the martial figures of Pua and Rubius are going to be very helpful for you. They are ways in which you can engage with those spirits and set them a set of agendas, right? Whether that's like just setting out to war, or whether that's the impassioned violence and bloodshed of the figure of Rubius, for instance, the scorpionic figure.
Ooh, that I must admit, it does sound tempting. See, that's the advantage of being in advanced corner, and you only get into the advanced corner if you know astrology.
Well, this is, you know, it pays off, right? You know?
It pays off. See, have you heard it? Bloodbaths, curses. It pays off. It pays off.
So that's how we get the when we're old and we're looking at like these young magicians and witches coming up, and we're complaining about how they don't, you know, read enough. Then that can be a way that we can. That's the carrot of the carrot and the stick, is it? That if you complete all your homework, then you'll know how to do proper blood magic.
I think the carrot of the sticks is posting pictures of people's bookshelves on the Instagram. It's like, you have to read to have that bookshelf. And it's just like, people can tell if you didn't read the books. They look too new.
Yeah.
But we've been talking before the show, but I have no idea if you actually had any time, or if you have any time to actually like do it. I was just mentioning about doing just a tiny little quick like a test try, just a demonstration for people. Like, I had a question, but I'm not sure how long is it going to take, and if you have it prepared or not, if we should just move on.
No, we can do a quick thing. So we talked a lot about doing shield charts, which are the main way that I think, and most, if you've got an important question, you should definitely do that. But there are ways of throwing shorter things. So one of those is if you have spirit contact of some kind, if you feel like, you know, you've just woken up from a dream and you want to check not exactly what the dream is about, but you want to do that initial kind of check of like, is this something worth taking to a diviner or a spiritual elder, or divining on myself in detail, right? Just that first checking to see if what you're getting is actually spirit contact of some kind, right? Rather than, you know, is it just that I, you know, that I kind of was just happening to be thinking about that, right? Which is a very important thing. We often say, you know, either you have perfect spirit vision, or you use a computational divination method, and we never see the two linked, right? We don't talk about that a lot, at least in European-derived Western magical traditions, right? But it's been my experience that confirming the messages that you think you're getting from spirits with short geomantic throws is incredibly useful. One of the ways that we can divide the figures up, for instance, is between mobile and static figures, right? So some figures are considered very stable, and if you're asking about something where stability is an advantage, then, you know, will I still have my job next week, right? A stable figure is a quick way of getting a yes answer, right? Likewise, a mobile figure in that case might well indicate no. You know, similarly, if you're asking about, you know, will my house move go successfully, you're looking for a mobile figure in that case. And so there are ways that you can use the geomantic figures very quickly just to check things. Now, I wouldn't advise that that's the only way you use them, because a shield chart, as I've talked about mainly, is way more accurate and will offer way more information and give you way more context and nuance. But you can just throw a couple figures and treat them as if they are a kind of witness and judge, right? So you wanted to ask about a move, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be moving in April, So I'm like, how I can get the most out of it.
Yeah, there we go. So that's a really good example of phrasing it well. Not like, will I move, but like, how can I make sure that I move, the move goes well, right?
Yes.
Okay, so normally I would do, normally if this was going to be a full chart, let's say we were sitting around at the pub, and this is something I do on occasion, is do divination at the pub or at a bar or something with friends, and we're discussing a thing. We're just checking up on stuff. We're not giving, life destiny kind of readings. We're just, getting people's opinions and their perspectives on things and the perspectives of their spirits and their ancestors. So I won't do the full round of prayers and things, but I'll do a brief little thing, and then we'll throw twice, and those can be our witnesses, and that will give us a kind of judge that we can look at, like things that we might need to consider for how to make sure that goes as well as it can, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Strategia sasta kasakre be turmoil sele talabona strihele medido khaso zo tanto tata adnayo lukin mabro apakate samo ke bore tata era el aksa etnisha amakdel dana lamos sachel bales galginium domos. Holy Spirit, the power of this reading that it may provide necessary and useful answers and advice for my client and friend for me.
That was awesome.
So the first figure we throw is Kaka, right? It's one of those Saturnine figures of the cell, of locking things down, of making sure that you've thought about all of the options, that you've cast a circle of some kind around the situation. Second figure, or the witness, if we like, in doing this very short form of reading, is also Kaka. So you have the idea of not just locking things down at the beginning, but also making sure that when you get there, you lock everything down, or that you're leaving, and then when you arrive and unpack, literally encircle it again, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what happens when you have two figures that are added to each other is it always produces the figure of populace, right? This is the thronging, and it can connote both a sense of everything packed in and feeling like sardines, right? That nothing can move because everything is so neatly, so pushed together. It can also signify a dissipation of things, like the way everyone knows everyone's business in a small town, right? So maybe this can connote, you have the idea of locking things down at the start, locking things down at the end. Maybe this could connote that you could do with, asking a bunch of people for some help on that. Now, that's a very, very quick way of getting just very quick answers.
That's so funny because you basically just ask you for advice about moving, but you literally had no idea about my moving situation. I swear to God, on the air, and didn't tell him anything. And he is spot on because there is a long anticipation of us moving. We knew for a year we might need to move, and then our landlord told us you're moving at the end of February, but then there's more anticipation because he said, okay, we can stay till April. So we knew we are going to we're trying to lock it down from the beginning. We're having a hard time with it, and there was this anticipation of moving for such a long time. And my idea is that we just have to find the right place and lock it. And it was definitely a sense of being like sardines because this place I would like to get something bigger. So it definitely was was very, very interestingly spot on.
Good. Yeah, it tends to do that. Glad to be helpful.
So obviously, for people who are now interested in learning the geomancy, you're going to have a course that starts in February. It's an online course, so available all around the world, right?
Exactly,
so if you can kind of tell people like what they are going to learn in that course, and obviously your website so they can find you.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So the course is a little bit different from just being a talk about some of the interesting features of it, or even explaining, the technique of how to set a shield. It's designed as training for people who want to be able to, at the end of the 8 hours that we do, have a good working knowledge of the figures, of roughly what they mean in the different houses, and how to cast geomancy for themselves and for their friends and family. Right? It's not just a start of how to explain geomancy to people, but hopefully it offers a foundation, hence the name, the Geomancy Foundation course, a foundation of training for people who, at the end of it, can consider themselves, beginner geomancers, right? It's an endeavor of mine to help revive geomancy from its kind of from not many people knowing about it these days. And I'm not alone in that. I would also recommend the works of Sam Block at the Digital Ambler blog, and also Balthazar Punja, and a couple of other projects he has, especially his videos on YouTube, which include some geometric candle magic. But really what this foundation course will do is offer people the basis of how to do this. We go through the figures in depth. We get a real sense of what they're about. One of the ways I like to talk about the figures is imagine you're sitting in a bar and describing the kind of bar or pub that each of the figures is about. So Pua, the boy, is kind of like a sports bar. Like there's all this macho-y kind of throwiness going on there. Whereas the figure of Tristisi, the Storro, is like a full-on goth bar with weird performance art in the corners and through dark. These kinds of ways in which we can think about how to visualize and engage deeper with the figures themselves. So we'll also go through a lot of the court configurations I spoke of, what specifically it means when each, the first and second witness say a particular thing that leads to a particular judgment, right? And that's also a way that we can be improving the subtlety and nuance and accuracy of our reading. And I'm also available once people take the course to answer specific questions. Some of my favorite things have been students coming to me with charts that they couldn't work out, and sitting down with them and seeing like, okay, have you thought to ask the client this kind of thing? One of the other advantages of geomancy is that it doesn't just provide answers, it also provides frameworks of how to present those answers to the client, right? Mm-hmm. So there are ways in which you can read a chart and say, this client is going to respond very badly if I'm not incredibly clear and, almost kind of blunt, rude even. This client needs me to be very, curt about this answer. Whereas, you can look at another chart and it can say, look, this client's been through a lot, and really you need to be very gentle when you're breaking this news to them. So these are also things that geomancy can help do. If the figure of Amicio, for instance, turns up in the first house, it can often signify that the client has forgotten to tell the geomancer something important. Right? If you know that rule, you can go back to them and say, look, is there something else? Rack your brain for something that you don't think is important to this, but might well be. I had a student who couldn't work out what was going on with a very simple question about a client of his or a friend of his trying to get a job. And it wasn't until, I noticed that they had a missio in the first house and asked my student, have you asked your client if there's something he forgot to mention? And it turns out the client wasn't legally allowed to work in that country, which is going to be a major issue with getting the job of sorts, right?
Yeah.
So things like that, and having an availability of consult for students that take the course. It isn't just here's 8 hours of material and now I jet and see you later, suckers, right? I'm really trying to build community of people interested in geomancy and interested in supporting each other and continuing to engage and even sort of hopefully in some ways kind of develop and sharpen their own abilities to work with the system and contribute and celebrate to the system of geomancy itself.
Sounds awesome. Where can I sign up?
You can sign up through, it's being hosted by my dear friends Wolf and Goat, if you're familiar with them, fine purveyors of, they're particularly known for their magical oils. That's the work of Jesse Hathaway Diaz and Troy Chambers. And Jesse is a particularly dear friend of mine. We co-host a podcast called Radio Free Golgotha. And we're also co-editors of a series called Focus Command Transmission for Revelor Press. And we put out an anthology of Cyprian and a couple of other texts on Cyprian and a few other texts. That I have a book on the history and the spellcraft associated with the Magi, the Three Kings, coming out through them in March, for instance. You sign up to the course through Wolf and Goat. If you search for Wolf and Goat Geomancy, it should pop up. You can also find me on Facebook or indeed on my website, which is www.alexandercummins.com. That's probably the easiest way to sign up for my mailing list. That's an easy way to know what's happening. And also, hopefully, this Geomancy Foundation course, when I've run it once before, really enjoyed it and got really good feedback from students and things. So run that a couple more times, and that will be eventually a prerequisite for more advanced classes on things like geomantic talismans, geomantic spirit work, and geomantic spellcraft. So it's important to get people on the same page, as I say, because geomancy can be very idiosyncratic. It starts to mold itself to your particular practice, which is a great thing and one of the things I love about it, but it means people need to be on the same page in the way that I practice it in order to receive that transmission and then tailor it to their own ends. Right? So starting with this foundation, you don't need to know any astrology, you don't need to know anything about geomancy beforehand. It's really as foundational and deals with the fundamentals and intricacies of the system. Right?
That sounds all interesting. That sounds all awesome. Obviously, I'm going to upload this show on the archive, which you can find the links on the Parx Radio website or on the show's website, www.thelunarlodge.com, or the Facebook or the Mixcloud, when I'm going to write all the links for Al's Geomancy course and his website. I especially recommend his blog, which is really, really awesome. I'm going to post all the links in the comment sections and in the show. And that's it for today. I'm really hoping you all enjoyed the Geomancy. So if I'm feeling inspired to learn something new. And yeah, thank you so much, Al, for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me, Astrid. I've really enjoyed it. It's always good to speak to you.
Yee! So thank you, Al. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I'm going to hear you either next week or the week after. Depends how much I will be actually having time, because it's kind of difficult with time right now. But I'm definitely going to hear you soon. And you know where to find me. So thank you so much for listening this week, and see you soon.